Feel free to stop me. If you have any questions, make sure you are asking, okay? So if I skip over something or you just need some clarification on it, make sure you ask. All right, so basic definition here of environmental science is just the study of the interaction of humans with the natural environment. I told you from day one, we talked about just briefly in my conversations, the expectations of class, that as we stand here, sit here, listen to me talk, you guys are stealing my oxygen, whatever it is, right? We're impacting the natural environment in some way. Okay, we have impacted the environment from the time you got here, from the time you woke up and started moving. There was some sort of impact on the natural world. Okay? The environment includes all of the living and non-living things that we interact with. Okay, so basically it's super, super broad. Everything around us, living, non-living, it includes all of it. Climate, okay, you know that's a big hot topic across the globe. Global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, right? That's a major hot topic that we're dealing with. Okay, we have an impact on it somehow, some way. Just our daily actions is having some sort of an effect. Soil and landforms, okay, we have an impact, especially with us living in a rural community, dealing with farming. Okay, every day there's some sort of impact on the soil and the landforms around us, whether it be tearing down trees or clear cutting so that we can get more farm ground, or just your daily farming. Okay, it includes that. So water sources, and we know we have a major impact, utilizing and using a lot of water. Maybe we're polluting water, whatever it may be. The environment includes all of those. And other living organisms. Okay, plants, animals, insects, bacteria. Okay, that's all part of the environment that we have an impact upon. Okay, environmental science and the issues that it studies are complex and interdisciplinary. Okay, that just means it incorporates concepts from multiple fields of study. If you look at the tree of science here, you can see it's just listed of, it's full of different fields of study in the scientific world: geology, chemistry, physics, anthropology, okay, zoology, paleontology. Okay, all of those have had studies that have impacted and researched and studied and brought together just these different ideas of environmental science, okay? So yes, there are people that specifically focus on the environment, but all of these fields of study have had some sort of contribution to those environmental concepts and environmental science issues. Just a little side note here. Humans have impacted the earth since the beginning of civilization. Okay? First humans on earth started having an impact upon the environment, whether it be, for nutritional purposes, water, for shelter. There was impact on the earth right from the get-go. So 2400 BC, agricultural fields in Samaria had very similar production in agriculture like we have today, right? I mean, this is about a third of what we can produce today because of technology, but they were able to produce a lot of agriculture, okay, a lot of crops. The Sumerians relied upon irrigation, just like we do today, right? Sumeria was in a much more arid climate than we are, so they relied heavily on, river sources, like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were both sources for irrigation to provide for the crops. So they started using those rivers to gain growth for their crops because they weren't getting enough just natural rainfall, so they had to irrigate it and use those rivers to get that source. All right, so what happened was, the water that they were using for irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates contained salt. Okay, all water has, a certain amount of minerals and salt in it. And what happened as they were using that irrigation is that salt started to build up on the Mesopotamia over years. Okay, salt is not good for crops to be growing in. So it built up this layer of salt. And what happened, those yields declined to half, then a fourth within a few hundred years. So more and more salt was sitting on top of the soil and unable to grow and to produce yields of crop like they initially did. They don't have tractors with big plows behind it to break those up. So they started using slave labor in the 7th century, all right, so that they could farm it. So it created, more work, but it also became a little bit more expensive at that point. Okay, and then by the 16th century, it was basically just a salty wasteland because they couldn't keep up. For the amount of salt that was being set upon the soil, it became wasteland at that point. Okay, and what that is that's an example of these two concepts of a collapse over time. Okay, one being this law of unintended consequences. Okay, the law of unintended consequences just states that the actions of people always is going to have some sort of unexpected effect. Okay, we do our best to research and understand and try to have an idea and plan for the future of what the effects could be by utilizing a certain process or a certain chemical or whatever it may be, but there's always going to be these unintended consequences of some sort. Okay, some things that we didn't think about. All right, so it's that whole concept of for every action there's an equal or opposite reaction, right? So talk about physics, there's going to be some sort of reaction to our action that we put into place. Okay, so that salt was not an intended consequence. They didn't know that was going to happen over a long period of time. They weren't prepared to deal with that. So that's why it failed after time, because that was an unintended consequence of using the irrigation to provide for the crops. Okay, and then the other term here is unsustainability. And that's just a condition that can't continue at its current rate. The key word sustainability is a big key, hot topic, big buzzword, and it has been for quite some time all across the globe. We want to find sustainable solutions to our impact on the environment, whether that, dealing with energy or agriculture, pollution. Okay, we want to find that sustainable balance so that we can maintain life and existence for a really long period of time. Okay, there's always concerns about this idea of unsustainability because population continues to grow at a super rapid pace and our consumption of resources continue to increase at a rapid pace because, we have to keep up with the population. That's why there's such a big push for sustainability, for different, ideas and uses of energy and things like that. Okay. I will be posting these on Google Classroom, so if I get going too fast and you get behind and need to go back or something, they will be on there. So just keep that in mind too. All right, Tragedy of the Commons. Okay, that's just an essay that this Hardin guy wrote that described a major source of environmental conflict. Okay, environmental conflict is just where you have different sides that have different viewpoints and different results. As intended. So commons are just an area that's shared and not owned, likely to be depleted as individuals pursue their own self-interests, right? We all have our own self-interests when it comes to how we should handle, specifically like a piece of land or something, right? So this idea of tragedy of the commons means there was some conflict and, that were unintended, looking back at the unintended consequences, they kind of go hand in hand here. So here's an example of some tragedy of the commons and just the conflict that comes into place. Here's an example of two small villages that consist mostly of farmers. They raise sheep and sell them at a nearby city. Okay, the first village, the top right picture, has a common pasture that all villages have unrestricted access to. Okay, so you picture this village that has a common ground, which wasn't uncommon back in the day to have this. So you form villages around family or other specific gifts or tools that people have. So you form these villages, and now you have this common ground that says, hey, you guys can use this ground for whatever, no rules, no restrictions, just use it as you see fit, that, whatever is most useful for you. Okay, so they started loading their sheep and just turned them loose inside this common ground. Okay, that's the first village. The second village has a pasture that got divided up into different sections that each farmer can own. So you fence it off and say, hey, farmer 1, you can have this section, farmer 2, you have this section. And within that section, you still have some unrestricted rights, but we're not just going to open this up and let anybody come in and utilize it any way they want. All right, so which one of those villages, 1 or 2, is going to have, or it's going to be least likely to experience that resource depletion, where those resources are consumed faster that can be replaced? Which one of those? 1 or 2 is going to have is more likely to experience resource depletion? 1 or 2? Who's got a guess? Number 1, right? Because there's no restrictions. Okay, it's just a big open pasture that people can use. You can do whatever the heck you want with it and deplete it and utilize it at any rate that you choose. And again, that wasn't that uncommon back in the day, right? Because a lot of ground wasn't owned by individuals. It was just free property out there for you to use and however you see fit and what's the most beneficial for your village and your little community. And years and years ago, that was, you could utilize and consume an area, and once it's depleted, you could pack your stuff up and move along to somewhere else. Okay, we don't have that necessarily much anymore. Really, not much at all anymore. Everything is individually owned pretty much, to an extent. So a couple of modern day examples of those commons, though, are, climate change is a great example of tragedy of the commons, because in air pollution, the atmosphere and the air that we breathe around us is a common space. We all utilize it. We're all using it somehow. And we have a major issue with, pollution, especially in your more populated cities. Higher industry, puts more pollution out. Water pollution, that's a common source that all of us utilize. I know each of us, many of us anyway, have our little, if we live out in the country, we have our own little wells that we're just pulling water from. Well, that doesn't magically appear. That water is still coming from a shared source, okay, from the groundwater, right? Whether it be coming from upstream, downstream, different rivers. Overfishing here in international waters is a modern day example. Utilizing and depleting resources that aren't renewing as fast as it's being consumed. All of those are considered tragedy of the commons in the modern day. So give you just a little bit of hope and something to look forward to. On this page, we're going to get through number 11 and we're going to stop. So whatever time's left will be yours after that. But the closer we get to that, the closer you get to me shutting my mouth. All right, so this just a little side note here: the Progressive Era. All right, we were coming from this industrial revolution. Things are progressing. People are expanding, populations are growing, but also thinking is changing a little bit. So in the U.S., the first environmental movement began with a series of conservation measures put into place by Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, he started to see, hey, our actions are changing our landscape. Things are changing around here, and that's probably not going to be great. So his goal was to prevent the resource depletion of those commons. Okay, so those common spaces that were still available, he wanted to protect those things and wanted to control the amount of logging, hunting, fishing, things like that people were using because they were depleting resources pretty rapidly. So here's what came into place, okay, during his time. We have the national parks were developed, okay, and created and put out there. Those are preserved areas that are relatively unaltered from the original state. They wanted to keep those things pristine and unchanged as much as possible. Okay, and still to this day, they're not allowing fishing, logging, or commercial hunting or any kind of livestock to be just on the property. Okay, they want to keep those things and utilize those things as long as they can. They want to sustain those resources. Because once that stuff is gone, it's gone for a long period of time, right? The other thing put into place were national forests, and these were all federally funded. So national parks as well, federally funded. Obviously national parks get a pretty big draw of visitors that help fund it as well, but it's federally funded. So national forests are also federally funded, but some of them do allow commercial logging for extra funds. But also, not only is commercial logging a funding thing, it's also, logging isn't always a bad thing. Everybody thinks that logging and cutting trees is always bad, but sometimes that allows for regrowth. You go in there and you cut down trees that, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, you start talking about infected trees by the emerald ash, the ash borer beetles that were destroying trees. You go in and cut those things down so that those infestations of those beetles weren't destroying other trees. You cut them down, you get them out of there, allows for regrowth. All right, so it's not always just a waste of resources. Sometimes it promotes new life. All right, and then the last one here we'll talk about is national wildlife refuges. Okay, they don't allow commercial activities at all, but they do allow recreational hunting and fishing. And that is, just to kind of control population of wild animals. Who knows of a national forest that we have in Indiana? Anybody name a national forest that we have in Indiana? Anybody, somebody. Show me you're alive. Help me out. Do we have any national parks in Indiana? National park or national forest? There's a national forest in Brown County. That's good. Do you know what the name of it is? Anybody know the name? I can't hear you. Turkey Run is a state park, beautiful state park. What are Indiana people or people from Indiana called? What are we called? Hoosiers, right? It's the Hoosier National Forest in southern Indiana. It's a very vast amount of forest, protected. They do allow hunting in there, just definitely no commercial logging. Everybody good here? All right, just introduce this, as we get into this environmental ethics thing, we'll talk about this Hetch Hetchy debate that popped up back in San Francisco, 1906, right? So after these national parks were put into place, you had this idea of conservation. San Francisco had an earthquake that was followed by a fire that destroyed tons and tons of homes and property around there. And most of that damage was due to the fire. Okay, and what happened was the city of San Francisco was exposed that they had an inadequate water supply. They weren't able to fight the fires because they were using the freshwater systems to fight the fires, and they ran out, right? The amount of water was slow to get to where it needed to be, and lots of things were destroyed because of the fire. Now, San Francisco is located in the Bay of the Pacific Ocean, but they weren't using that because it's obviously not a freshwater system. All right, so then what happened because of that exposure to the inadequacy of water supply? The city of San Francisco applied to the federal government to construct a reservoir in this Hetch Hetchy Valley in the Yosemite National Park, miles and miles and miles away. Okay, they wanted to construct this dam to build a reservoir to use the fresh water to be able to, supply their freshwater systems in the city, not only to fight fires, but also to provide enough fresh water for survival. All right, so for that dam to get constructed, it would have had to pass Congress. So they had to present it to Congress and then signed off by the president at the time. Environmental ethics came into place because for them to build this dam, they had to go into this national park and they had to basically destroy what they thought, a lot of people thought, they was destroying resources. They were having to cut trees or just dig holes and force animals and other organisms in the area to move out of that area. All right, so it led to two different philosophies of environmental ethics. Environmental ethics is just that moral relationship that people have with the environment. And we all need to have that, right? We all need to have at least an awareness and a care and a concern of how our actions are impacting the environment around us. But there's two different philosophies that we'll take a look at that, are opposite ends of the spectrum, basically. First one, anthropocentrism. I call this one the selfish philosophy. Right? It's a human-centered philosophy that protects and promotes human interests at the expense of all other factors. Okay, so if you look at the hierarchy, if you look at these pictures off to the right, the top right, it's a hierarchy thing. Humans are at the top, everything else is below, and it's only, everything else on Earth is only here to make sure that humans are fulfilled. Okay? And there's a lot of people that follow that still, right? So they think that everything else is only here for our consumption. And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum here with ecocentrism, which is a very nature-centered philosophy that places value on ecosystems, no matter what the usefulness to humans is. All right, so I call this one the harmony picture. Everything kind of works together in harmony. All right, this is your, for lack of better terms, it's your hippie philosophy, right? Your tree huggers and stuff will fit into this philosophy, which isn't a bad thing by any means, right? Because we all have a responsibility. Yes, we as humans have a lot of needs that need to be met, right? We need to utilize resources. Maybe not to the extent that many of us do, but we also have to recognize that all other organisms and ecosystems, they have needs too, right? It's not, all those things aren't put here just for our consumption. Okay, it's kind of what makes the world go round. We've got to have that, somewhere in that, the balance of the two. All right, so this guy named John Muir, he was the founder of the Sierra Club, which, eventually became founders of those national parks and, was a big advocate in those development of national parks, national forests, and things like that. He was the one that really pushed this idea of ecocentrism that, hey, our ecosystems around us, need us as much as we need them. All right, so in the end, if you look at number 10 here, it says, what was the result of the Hetch Hetchy debate? All right, so there was some conflict between two sides. You had your conservationists that were saying, hey, don't build this dam because you're destroying a national park, basically. But what the result was the construction of the dam was happening. They built the dam. Okay, that was the end result. The dam was still being built, and it's still functioning and in use today. Okay, so that was the end result. And then the second part of number 10 says, describe the conservation ethic philosophy that decision was based upon. All right, and that matches this Gifford Pinchot's statement in his environmental ethic decision, right? His quote here, and I'll break it down a little bit so you can kind of understand it. It says, where conflicting interests must be reconciled, right? So there was conflicting interest. You have the city of San Francisco in need. They wanted to build this dam. They thought it was the best solution. This is what we want to do. And then you had the conservation side saying, no, we can't have you do that because it's going to destroy it. We have to come up with a different option. So there was the conflict, okay? But it needed to be reconciled. There had to be some kind of reconciliation to move forward. All right, and then it says, the question shall always be answered from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. Okay, and what that means is when you're looking at the situation, okay, we have this conflict in place. San Francisco needs water. Conservationists say, don't destroy my park. Okay, you got two sides there. You're going to look at this. What's the greatest good for the greatest number in the longest run? Okay, the greatest number in that situation was the people of San Francisco. They needed a fresh water supply. Okay, that's a large number of people. It's a large city. They didn't have a good fresh water supply. They needed it. All right? For the greatest good. Okay, that's the water. They're providing now, by doing this, by allowing this dam to be built and a reservoir to be built, the greatest good is the people are going to benefit from this water source. And for the longest run, meaning, is this going to last for a really long period of time? Okay, or is this just a really temporary fix? And you can see this was done in 1914 and it's still happening today. So I would say for the long run, that was probably a good decision. It's a hard decision because, I mean, especially at the government level, they don't want to destroy parks for the benefit of humans typically. But in this situation, it met the greatest good of the greatest number for the longest run. Okay, that's sustainability right there. Okay, so when we make decisions from here on out, and even individually, but especially at the federal level, when you make a decision, this question should always come into mind. What's the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest amount of time? If you can answer and come up with a decision that answers all three of those things, you should be good to go, right? And that at least puts the environment into play and it shows some consideration. Questions on that? Now you can summarize that part as much as you want. You don't have to fill in all what I just said, but summarize that how you see fit so you understand it. All right, we're almost there, guys. I promise you. All right, so during this progressive era, okay, conservationists are coming into play. We're still moving forward, but we want to do it at a rate that's sustainable so that our environment isn't affected too much. Okay, so the conservationists categorized resources, into four different groups. One being inexhaustible resources that can't be used. Okay, the example would be the sun. Okay, there's nothing that we're doing today necessarily that's going to make the sun disappear. Okay, it rises and it sets. All right, so inexhaustible. And you have your renewable, which those resources can be replaced, but it takes a long time. Okay, so we've cut trees, and we still cut trees today. We still grow crops where we have to till the soil and use the nutrients from the soil to grow crops from year in to year out. Those are renewable, but they do take a long time to replenish. Then you have your non-renewable resources that are consumed at a much, much faster rate than they can be replenished. Okay, so your coal, your oil, your natural gases that are used for energy purposes. Okay, when our population is increasing as rapidly as it is, there's a much greater need for energy resources, right? And we've always used coal, oil, and natural gas, but obviously in the last 20-some years or more, there's been a major shift in focus on the type of energy that we should be using. So you're starting to see more hydropower, more wind power, more solar power. Okay? Those things are coming into play because we're aware and we understand that renewing those natural resources takes a really, 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 really long time. And we're trying to get to that point where we can sustain for a long period of time. If you continue to use coal, oil, and natural gas at a high rate, we can't sustain that at the pace that we're growing. And then the last one here is those recyclable, renewable resources. Okay, they're not replaced at the rate that they're used, but they can be used more than once. Okay, so your metals, your precious metals from the ground are the example we're talking about. Iron, aluminum, copper are examples. All right, and we understand, I'm assuming you guys all know that when you're using those things, if you use iron, aluminum, or copper specifically, once they're used and you're done, your usefulness is used up, you can take those to places to recycle them and you get paid for them, right? So we have things into place that promote that recycling of those resources there, all right?